You know that feeling, right? You want to get your head around something big, maybe a fundamental shift in how we see the world, but you're just faced with mountains of information.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming.
Well, that's where we come in. This is the deep dive. We try to be your shortcut to understanding those core ideas, the essential insights, helping you connect the dots without getting totally bogged down.
And today, the big thing we're diving into is this really massive change in perspective, what people often call the postmodern paradigm.
Right.
It's a genuine shakeup to that older, more established modern or Enlightenment way of thinking.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating, I think, is that the sources we looked at for this deep dive show, it's not just some abstract academic thing.
Not at all.
It's actually having a tangible impact. You see it across all sorts of fields, science, religion, even social issues.
So our mission here, really, is to get to the heart of this paradigm shift. What are its key characteristics? What actually led to it?
And maybe most importantly, why should you care? Why does it matter today?
Yeah, because like you said, this isn't just theory. It has real-world consequences for how we interpret, well, pretty much everything around us.
One thing that definitely comes through in the material is that this whole shift, it's still happening. We're kind of in the middle of it.
Right, so expect some open questions, maybe a bit of uncertainty.
That's actually part of the deal, isn't it? Part of this whole transition. Okay, so where do we start? Maybe with the foundations. What were the first signs that the old way of thinking was starting to crack?
Well, it's interesting because the sources really point back to the Enlightenment itself. The period we usually think of as this great leap forward, the triumph of reason.
Descartes, radical doubt.
Exactly. That idea that pure reason, applied systematically, could lead us to certain knowledge, clearing away all the old assumptions based on just faith or tradition, that became incredibly influential for centuries.
Yeah, and you had those two main scientific tracks, both putting reason on a pedestal. Bacon's inductive method observing first, then concluding.
And Descartes' deductive approach, more mathematical, logical, even Newton tried to kind of merge them.
But the common thread was reason as the ultimate tool, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it seemed to work.
Yeah.
Look at the scientific and technological progress. It felt so powerful, so logical.
So it's no surprise, really, that other fields jumped on board. The human sciences, even theology, started trying to fit into that rational mold. Science almost became this gold standard for absolute, objective truth.
But here's the twist. The sources suggest the first really big cracks didn't come from outside, like from philosophy or art, where you might sort of expect critique.
Where then?
From within physics, the very heartland of Enlightenment success. You think about Einstein, Bohr, the quantum revolution.
Yeah, mind-bending stuff.
Totally.
Oh.
And Heisenberg basically saying the foundations of science themselves were shifting. That's huge.
A revolution inside the revolution. That really does shake things up. And then on top of that scientific upheaval, you have these immense historical shocks.
The world wars.
Exactly. Our sources really emphasize how those events just shattered that easy confidence, that sort of naive realism of the Enlightenment.
That straightforward belief that the world is just there, exactly as we see it. No interpretation needed.
Yeah. After witnessing that kind of devastation, it got a lot harder to maintain that simple faith in inevitable progress and the clean power of reason.
Precisely. And that sort of opened the door for more fundamental critiques to gain traction. You had Karl Barth shaking up theology with his theology of crisis.
Right, challenging the liberal consensus.
And then thinkers looking at the bigger sweep of history, like Spengler or Sorokin, saying, hey, something big is changing in Western culture.
And Romano Guardini just comes right out and says it. The end of the modern era. That's pretty blunt.
It really is. It signals a feeling that a fundamental chapter had closed.
What about the Frankfurt School? People like Horkheimer and Adorno, they were wrestling with this too, weren't they?
They were. They saw that science wasn't this purely benevolent force anymore, that progress could actually turn into regress, into its opposite.
But they were still trying to hold on to some core Enlightenment ideals.
That's a really key point from the sources. They saw the problems, the dialectic of Enlightenment, but they seemed hesitant to completely let go of reason as the ultimate judge.
Which is where Habermas comes in later.
Exactly. Habermas critiqued them for not going far enough, for not fully abandoning those traditional ideas about reason. He argued for a deeper critique, one that really foregrounded history, the human subject, and the role of social groups.
And this feels like where Michael Polanyi and Thomas Kuhn become absolutely central.
Oh, definitely. Polanyi's personal knowledge, Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, Game changers.
Kuhn's opening line about how studying history can transform our image of science itself, that really lands the point about context, doesn't it?
It really does. They hammered home that scientific knowledge isn't just some neutral pile of facts waiting to be discovered.
It's shaped.
Deeply shaped by the historical moment, by the scientists themselves, their beliefs, their training, and by the communities they work in.
And the sources point out this interesting convergence, right? Habermas, Ricoeur, Thompson, Taylor, different fields, but all kind of arriving at similar conclusions.
Yeah, about how interconnected it all is. Scientific theory, history, sociology, the act of interpretation, or hermeneutics.
So it's moving beyond just cold, hard logic. Habermas talks about communicative reason happening between people alongside that older instrumental reason, which is just about getting things done.
And Kuhn's basically saying knowledge emerges from historical situations and how scientists talk and agree, not just from some objective process. It almost flips the old model.
Instead of pure thought dictating reality, our being in the world, our interactions, shape how we think.
Precisely. Okay, so if we take that as the backdrop, the source material then digs into how this paradigm shift specifically challenges some key Enlightenment characteristics. Let's start with rationality itself.
The Enlightenment put reason on a very high pedestal.
Extremely high. And theology, for instance, responded in various ways, trying to engage with this dominance of the rational.
Right, trying to frame Christianity as, a unique personal feeling or something totally private, or even arguing it was more rational than science, or maybe just a set of useful social rules.
Or even a way to kind of break free from older, maybe less rational religious forms. There was definitely an undercurrent of anxiety that religion was losing ground, becoming irrelevant in a scientific age.
But then the twist.
The big twist. The sources highlight this really unexpected resurgence of religion in the 20th century. And not just one kind.
Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism growing.
Christianity, too, especially the explosive growth of Pentecostalism. Even in places where Enlightenment thinking was strong, or where religion was actively suppressed, faith showed remarkable resilience.
It's almost the exact opposite of what many people predicted.
It is. Now, the sources acknowledge some cynical interpretations. Maybe people turn to religion out of fear, or to escape complex problems, or it's just a kind of surface-level thing.
But they argue there's something deeper going on.
Exactly. A more fundamental reason. That the Enlightenment's very narrow definition of rationality just wasn't cutting it. It couldn't account for the full range of human experience and longing. It kind of flattened things out.
So the answer wasn't to ditch reason entirely.
No, not at all. It was more about expanding our understanding of what counts as rational, recognizing, for example, the limits of language itself. Bateson's idea that we often probe rather than prove, that applies to science too, not just theology.
Which opens the door to reevaluating things the Enlightenment tended to dismiss.
Like metaphor, myth, analogy. Think of Northrop Frye's work showing how central metaphor is to the Bible. Trying to boil it all down to literal, logical statements misses the richness.
And the source mentions early church figures warning against trying to, master God by reason.
Right. It's about bringing back these other ways of knowing symbols, rituals, signs, myths. The argument isn't that they're irrational,
but that they address different dimensions of reality, integrating mind and will in ways that purely logical reasoning can't.
Precisely. They engage the whole person. This helps make sense of things like the rise of narrative theology, especially in the Global South, where story and lived experience carry so much weight.
It's about seeing the limits of what Polanyi called scientism, turning science into the only valid way of knowing.
Which could be just as rigid as any dogma. True rationality, maybe like Gregory of Nazianzus suggested, isn't about having all the neat logical answers, but about integrating different kinds of knowing to get a fuller picture of truth.
And that includes experience.
Absolutely. Thinkers like Schleiermacher emphasize feeling and experience. And you see it powerfully in movements like Pentecostalism or the charismatic renewal. Experience is central.
So it's not anti-science or anti-reason. It's more like integration. Taking the best of modern thought, but pushing back against that reductionist tendency.
Exactly. Reconceiving rationality to make space for the religious dimension, the spiritual. Guardini's analogy is great. An engine needs oil to run smoothly.
And Stackhouse suggesting civilization itself needs that religious element, or West talking about how secular gods fill the vacuum when faith declines.
Yeah, it leads into this really complex discussion about postmodernity, science, and faith. The source warns against overly simplistic harmonies. you know.
Like Fritjof Capra trying to neatly blend Eastern mysticism and physics.
Right. Josudas raises a really important flag there, the potential poison if postmodern thinking just swallows religion whole without grappling with the challenges authentic faith often presents.
Like Christianity's stance against injustice, its focus on victims, the call for repentance, those aren't always comfortable fits with existing worldviews.
Definitely not. A superficial blend might just smooth over those critical edges. And the source notes that in places dealing with serious systemic injustice, there's not much appetite for that kind of easy integrationism.
So while maybe the old science versus religion battles seem kind of dated,
Tensions definitely remain. And the future role of religion looks complex, diffuse. It calls for, as the source puts it, a chastened and humble witness.
okay, moving beyond rationality then. Another big Enlightenment feature was that subject-object split. Humanity over here, nature over there.
And humanity clearly in charge, viewing nature primarily as an object to be studied, controlled, exploited.
The source argues this had some really damaging results, seeing nature as this closed, simple, shallow, unmysterious thing, just resources waiting for us.
And the irony, instead of ultimate freedom, it kind of led to us being enslaved by our own technology, by the relentless drive for production above all else.
And the most obvious, disastrous consequence.
The ecological crisis,
Yeah.
presented very clearly in the sources as a direct result of that Cartesian objectifying model, treating the Earth like a machine, not a living system we're part of.
So the call is for a fundamental reorientation.
Towards holistic thinking, yeah. Breaking down those false dualisms, mind-body, subject-object, thinking in terms of togetherness, symbiosis.
Which has huge implications for how we engage with the world, right? Not seeing people or nature as just objects for our plans or conversions.
It means confronting our technology, our ambitions, with deeper realities, with values that go beyond purely rational calculation. The source mentions the reign of God as that kind of ultimate reality check.
Okay, another big shift. Rediscovering purpose, the teleological dimension.
Yeah, the Enlightenment kind of threw purpose out, didn't it? Focused on efficient causes, how things happen, not why. Which, the argument goes, ultimately leaves the universe feeling a bit meaningless.
But people crave meaning. So the 19th century filled that gap with this huge belief in inevitable progress, Darwinian evolution.
Which even shaped theology, leading to that post-millennial idea that society would just keep getting better and better, leading to the kingdom of God on earth.
But the 20th century saw a pretty radical swing back.
Towards eschatological theology, a renewed focus on the end times, not necessarily predicting apocalypse, but reintroducing contingency, unpredictability, the idea of an ultimate horizon.
And this shift brought renewed hope, especially for marginalized groups.
Exactly. And revived concepts like repentance, conversion, having a vision for the future, taking responsibility. It brings back that sense of ultimate direction.
And this connects to the challenge against the idea of progress with a capital P, doesn't it?
Very much so. The source links that Enlightenment faith in linear progress directly to things like colonial expansion, the whole benevolent colonialism idea.
Even how mission work evolved
Yeah.
from simple charity to a comprehensive approach. Then after World War II, this big focus on development.
Ah, yes, development. The 1960s, the decade of the secular, were peak development enthusiasm, massive optimism, both secular and religious, that we could engineer solutions for the third world.
Lots of conferences, big plans.
Huge plans. But the results often weren't what was expected.
Richer countries often got richer, inequality actually increased in many places, and there were terrible social and ecological side effects.
Right. It forced a realization that technology isn't neutral. It carries values, it's tied to social structures, power dynamics.
And the power issue was critical.
Absolutely. The source highlights the unwillingness, or maybe inability, of Western developers to genuinely share or transfer power. That power gap just got wider.
Which led to a backlash.
A major backlash. Growing rejection in the third world of the whole development model and its underlying Enlightenment assumptions. Deserialismo became a dirty word.
So the problem wasn't seen as just backwardness anymore.
No, the analysis shifted. It became about dependency versus liberation, understanding the systemic issues.
And some propose pretty radical solutions like overthrowing the whole system.
Yes, but the source adds a crucial note of caution there too. Even liberation models aren't always free from Enlightenment baggage.
Like assuming that whoever takes power will automatically be good or just.
Exactly. Referencing things like the Reign of Terror in France or other revolutions where power corrupted. It's a warning against naive assumptions about human nature, even in the context of liberation.
Okay, so another pillar, the fact-value distinction.
Yeah.
Sharp Enlightenment separation.
Yeah, facts are objective. Values are subjective. Keep them separate. The source argues that distinction has basically collapsed.
How so?
Well, partly through science itself. The realization that observation changes the thing observed. Polanyi's point that every act of knowing involves appraisal, judgment. It's not neutral.
And the sheer power of modern science made neutrality impossible anyway.
You can't pretend developing nuclear weapons is just a neutral, fact-based exercise. Hiroshima and Nagasaki made that terrifyingly clear.
The source quotes Bloom calling the fact value split the suicide of science. Pretty strong words.
And Polanyi saying objectivism has actually falsified our whole idea of truth.
And the third world critique comes in again here, challenging the supposed neutrality of Western science.
Pointing out its cultural biases, its imperialist assumptions, how it was used in exploitation. The idea emerges that there are no brute facts, only interpreted facts, seen through the lens of our existing beliefs, our plausibility structure.
Which then opens the door for ideology.
Right. Because if science claims ultimate objectivity, then ideologies, political or economic, whatever, can try to hijack that authority, presenting themselves as purely rational and scientific when they're really value-laden belief systems.
Functioning almost like substitute religions.
Exactly. Providing comprehensive worldviews, often demanding total commitment. So you have physics, challenging objectivity from within, the terrifying ambiguity of power, critiques from the global south, the rise of these powerful ideologies. It all points to a crisis in that old Enlightenment framework.
So pure objectivity is what? A delusion.
A false ideal, according to Polanyi. He argues we need to acknowledge belief faith, commitment as the starting point for all knowledge, embracing a fiduciary framework.
That Augustine quote, "Unless you believe, you shall not understand."
Precisely. It's about trusting our intuition, our tacit knowledge, that deep knowing that goes beyond explicit rules. Polanyi says it's actually primary.
This ties into Kuhn's paradigms too, right? Those frameworks that shape how we even see the world.
Yeah, paradigms provide the plausibility structure. They're incredibly powerful, but often invisible until they start to break down, until we lose faith in them.
But isn't the danger then just falling into pure subjectivism? If everything is belief, is any belief as good as any other? Kuhn's earlier stuff sometimes sounded a bit like that.
That's a fair concern, and the source acknowledges it. Kuhn did refine his views later. And Polanyi strongly argued that a fiduciary framework, starting with belief, isn't irrational. It doesn't mean anything goes.
So it's not objectivism versus subjectivism.
Not necessarily. It's more like moving towards a critical realism, maybe. Acknowledging our convictions are context-bound, but still holding them responsibly.
Which requires humility, self-criticism.
Absolutely essential in this post-Enlightenment view. Polanyi talks about our critical powers actually being enhanced once we recognize the limits of pure objectivity, like we've plucked a second apple of awareness.
And this self-critical faith can protect us.
From the blindness of ideologies, yeah. From utopian dreams that ignore reality, from self-deception.
But losing that clear fact-value line, it makes things feel less certain, maybe more dangerous.
It does. We're more exposed, more aware of potential new tyrannies, new anxieties. But the source also notes something interesting. The attacks on religion during the Enlightenment actually forced Christians to rethink and renew the very foundations of their faith.
Which is relevant for engaging with other faiths today.
Very relevant. Okay, almost there. Chastened optimism. That core Enlightenment belief that we can solve all problems through reason and progress.
That's taken a hit, hasn't it?
A big hit.
Yeah.
Grand Western schemes haven't always worked out. That dream of a perfectly ordered, unified world has often felt more like a nightmare for many.
And that optimism of the 60s and early 70s.
In retrospect, maybe it looks like a sign of the West not quite realizing its era of dominance was ending. Since the 70s, the mood has darkened somewhat, a renewed awareness of evil, of limits.
But it doesn't have to mean pessimism.
No. The source suggests it creates an opening, an opportunity for faith communities to present a different kind of hope. The vision of God's reign, maybe, as an ultimate reality that gives meaning now, but isn't dependent on naive optimism or susceptible to cynical pessimism.
A third way, almost.
Kind of. And finally, interdependence, the Enlightenment focus on the individual, pursuing their own happiness.
Which the source argues has led to some downsides: isolation, nihilism.
Yeah, Bloom's critique is mentioned modern liberalism leading to not taking others, or even oneself, seriously, escaping into frantic work or play because there are no strong external anchors.
That celebrated individual autonomy ending up in alienation.
Or new forms of dependence, yeah. Freedom of belief potentially becoming freedom from belief. A refusal of interdependence leading to isolation.
So the call is to rediscover community, commitment.
Reaffirm conviction, retrieve that sense of togetherness, interdependence, that symbiosis idea again. Seeing the individual as part of a larger organism.
Including nature.
Including nature. Global well-being requires seeing the connections. Moving from a psychology of separateness to an epistemology of participation.
From the me generation to the us generation, perhaps.
And bringing back Habermas's communicative reason alongside instrumental reason because we exist with others. Our reality is intersubjective.
Which makes rediscovering the church as a body or mission as building community feel very relevant again.
Exactly. It resonates with this shift away from radical individualism towards interconnectedness.
Okay, wow, that's a lot to cover. So just to wrap up, we've traced this really significant shift, haven't we? From that Enlightenment focus on individual reason, objectivity, progress, controlling nature.
To a more postmodern sensibility that emphasizes context, interpretation, the limits of our knowledge, interconnectedness, and the importance of belief and community.
And we've stressed this isn't just academic navel-gazing.
Absolutely not. It fundamentally changes how we understand ourselves, how we think we know things, and how we relate to the world and each other. It's playing out all around us.
So maybe a final thought for you listening right now. How might this big shift from modern to postmodern ways of seeing things be influencing your own assumptions, maybe in ways you haven't really thought about before?
Yeah, how do you approach information? How do you hold your beliefs? How do you think about your connections to others, to the planet?
It's worth reflecting on which broad paradigm, maybe a mix of both, is shaping your thinking most profoundly right now.